Okay, welcome to part 5 of this history of Jerusalem, history of Israel, history of the Jewish people. And today we want to start with the end of World War I. We're in Israel. Last time we talked about the Jewish people and just the rise of Zionism, a lot of things. Actually, we went about 1600 years last session. And by the way, there's 7 sessions in all, so this is session 5, okay? So at the end of World War I, remember that the Ottoman Empire pretty much they controlled all the Middle East. Well, at the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was split up, and part of it was allowed to stay as the nation of Turkey, and then the rest of the old um, Ottoman Empire was divided up among the Allies. And in particular, there's the French Mandate and there's the British Mandate that basically took charge of, a lot of the Middle East. The British Mandate, they took, they, the British all of a sudden began to control Palestine and Jordan. The French, it was more Lebanon and Syria. And even today, in Lebanon, French is one of the official languages. Well, there were also, after World War I, there were waves of Jewish immigrants into Israel. And of course, the British were in charge, and most of them ended up on kibbutz and on the kibbutz in various ones. And so this was the time where the kibbutz, movement started or really kind of gained momentum. We talked about that last time. And then all of a sudden, there's tensions between the Arabs and the Jews, and part of it was that that all during the Ottoman Empire, or at least for the last several hundred years, there were some well-established Arab families that the Ottoman Empire just let kind of control things in Jerusalem and in Israel. And all of a sudden, the British were there. Then all these waves of Jews were coming in, and they were talking about, oh, we want a homeland here, we want to stay here. And all of a sudden, you had tensions there. And surprisingly, the British favored the Arabs. Now, why is that? There's a couple reasons. One was the Arabs had access to something that all of a sudden was very needed after World War I, and that was oil. And so, I know it always happens, oil can kind of, make allies with people. And that's what happened with the British and the Arabs. Also, the British really enjoyed the rich Arab families. They would wine and dine in them. In fact, there's a lot of stories about, romantic, you know, uh, partnerships that kind of took place, really affairs that took place between a lot of the leading British um, um, leaders that were in the Palestine area and some of the rich Arab families. And then also most of the Jews that were coming in, they were coming in from Europe. They were poor. They they tended to kind of go more toward agriculture. They did they were usually more educated than the Arab families, but and also as we kind of talked about last time, a lot of the Jews were kind of labeled as communists, especially if they got to join a kibbutz. And so what happened, not all, but a lot of the British started favoring the Arabs. And the Arabs really wanted to, we don't want all these Jews coming in. And so you had, in fact, you had these restrictions put on. In fact, in 1939, there was the White Paper. It's the famous White Paper, and it was a British document which severely restricted British immigration into Palestine. Well, about this time, the Haggadah, and the Haggadah, there's all sorts of stories and movies and um, uh, legends about the Haggadah. The Haggadah started around 1920 and it went all the way to 1948 when Israel got its independence. And it was a paramilitary group of Jews, mainly on the kibbutz, that started kind of training. They didn't have many weapons, but they decided they would kind of help protect the kibbutz from raids from the Arabs. And also, the other thing that the Haganah did was that they worked out kind of an elaborate system of smuggling Jews into Palestine. And so, again, there's a lot of just books and movies written about this, where ships of Jews would kind of come in, and they would be signaling the Haganah on shore. Yes, it's saved. No British are here now. And then they kind of take them in by rowboats, and then they kind of would quickly kind of take them inland and start putting them in various kibbutz. I mean, very interesting, uh, period of history. So this was a Zionist military organization. And by the way, David Ben Gurion was the leader uh, in the later years of the Haganah. And of course, for those who go to Israel, you'll know that, well, the airport is called the Ben Gurion Airport. And he was the first president of Israel, and he's sort of the George Washington of Israel. And so anyway, so he was associated with the Haganah. Now, we also kind of see another more militant group spin off of the Haganah, and that was the Irgun. And the Irgun, they favored terrorist tactics to terrorize the British and the Arabs, because they said, unless we fight back, we're not going to get anywhere. That the Haganah just weren't militant enough. And the Irgun probably kind of made things worse, because all of a sudden it was, attacks on Arabs, and then the Arabs make attacks on Jews. And this happened really that whole era between World War I and World War II, and really all the way even accelerated after World War II until Israel got its independence, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So this is the time of a lot of Arab revolts, and the British, they were sort of in the middle. They kind of favor the Arabs, but yet there's a lot of public pressure at home to, wait a minute, the Jews want a homeland. There's nothing wrong with that. And then, of course, there are countries like the United States and other people who are really advocating, yes, let Israel kind of have its, let the Jews go back to, to the land of Palestine. So this is a very interesting period of history. A lot's been written about it, and especially just smuggling people, Jews, into Palestine, and they had a very elaborate system, like I said. Now, during World War II, it's kind of interesting, because the leading Arab families and the elite Arab families of Jerusalem actually sided with Hitler. And Hitler had a lot of just secret negotiations going on, which is kind of odd, because Britain was in the war against, Hitler and Germany. So that kind of really makes it even more interesting. So World War II, as you know, was really a disaster for Jews. Um, Many Western countries would not receive the fleeing Jews. Uh, Great Britain, the United States was among them. And of course, it ended up, 6 million, an estimated 6 million Jews were killed in Europe. Some of them, before things got bad, immigrated into Palestine, but most did not make it. A lot of them, especially the more religious Jews, remember we talked about this last time, they were waiting for the Messiah. They weren't going to kind of force this having our own homeland. And many of those people ended up dying. Now, and I'm not going to go into the whole thing about the Holocaust, because there's been so much written on it. There's movies about it, and I don't think I really need to do that for the sake of this series here. But in Palestine, actually it's kind of interesting. The Haganah actually helped Great Britain defend Palestine against Nazi Germany. And so the Haganah and Great Britain actually teamed up, during World War II. And the Haganah, the British found out that the Haganah, they knew the land pretty well, and they were pretty good fighters, and so they depended on them. And also for the Haganah, they were able to, get some type of experience in actually war that's really came in useful a little bit later. and 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 also they began to you know gather weapons, to more weapons, the Haggadah, because they knew that once this war is over, we're going to go back and we're going to try to press for Israel being their homeland for the Jews. Well, pretty soon, right after World War II, there was another Zionist organization that split off from the Irgun. So the Irgun split off from the Haganah, and then the Lehi kind of spun off from the Irgun, and they were more radical. In fact, their idea, and this is after World War II, was they wanted to get rid of the British completely. And so they actually assassinate a top British leader in Palestine, and it just became really, there's just a lot of killing going on, and it was in the time from end of World War II, 1945 to 1948. Um, there's one particular time. This was in April 9th, 1948. There's the massacre in um, it's Deir Yasin. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but basically the Irgun and the Lehi teamed up together, and they just wiped out, just massacred a whole town. Between It was really on the old road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The Haganah, to their credit, condemned the massacre because they said, wait a minute, we just got through World War II and the Holocaust. We don't condone this type of killing, this terrorist type of killing. And but the others kind of felt like, wait a minute, the Holocaust, they almost wiped us out. We're not going to let that happen again. So there's a lot of tension within the Jewish community. Now, what about the Orthodox Jews? The the Hasidic Jews. They didn't want to have anything to do with any of it, the Haganah or any of these Jewish Zionist groups. In fact, they actually kept a pretty good relationship in Jerusalem with the old Arab families. So it became sort of a hodgepodge of just mixed interest, and you didn't know who was fighting who. It seemed like at times. Well, this the couple years before 1948, which is when Israel gained their independence, there was a lot of you know raids on the Arabs, and then the Arabs raiding the Jews. And there was part of Jerusalem that was bombed. There was the King David Hotel was bombed. It had a lot of diplomats in it. And there's one section, in fact, the Yehuda section of Jerusalem, where if you if you're going with Emmanuel Fellowship, we're going to be kind of staying. That was all bombed out by the Arabs at one point. So there's a lot of tension going on. November 29, 1947, it finally comes up with the United Nations, a vote to give Israel their own land. And what was going to happen, the land of Palestine would be divided into two territories. There'd be the Arab, or you call that Palestine, and then there'd be the Jewish. And Jerusalem was a part of the of the Arab section. You know, um, the and there's a pretty large section to the Arabs, but there was still a lot of opposition. We don't want to give Israel their land. The land that was designated for Israel was pretty much the land of Galilee and then down the coast of Israel. Well, there's just a lot of drama leading up to this vote. They needed, I think, 2/3 or 60%. I can't remember exactly what, but it was more than 50%, and a lot of nations had decided to abstain. In fact, even England did not vote for Israel to have it because, again, they were kind of cozy to the Arabs. They abstained, and and Jews around the world, here in the United States and in Israel, it was broadcast, live, vote after vote. And then the United States, when it got to the United States, there weren't many countries left. The United States actually gave the vote that authorized Israel to be their own nation. And immediately afterwards, the Arabs vow revenge. We're not going to let this happen. And even before it was scheduled for May 1948, and the Arabs, they blocked the road to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, and they basically were they tried to starve the Jewish community in Jerusalem, and Jews were trying to kind of sneak supplies up to Jerusalem, which is about 3,000 feet above sea level. And and by the way, the British during this time, they they were they were getting quite impatient with the Jews. And by the way, the Deir Yasin massacre actually happened, at this time too, between the UN vote, and the time that it would actually take place. Um, so basically, there's about 5, 6 months of a lot of tension between Arabs and Jews. The British said in May, we're getting out of it. We don't want to have a part of this. Um, Many Americans, Jews and non-Jews, especially fighter pilots, they came to Israel to kind of help prepare for what they knew was going to be a war of independence. And the United States government said, if you go and you help Israel, then you're going to lose your U.S. citizenship. Now, afterwards, they changed that, but for a while, that was the case. But still, you had a lot of Americans, again, the fighter pilots, they ended up going to Israel to help out. There was trying to smuggle planes into Israel from Europe. And, how do you smuggle planes in? I mean, the British were still kind of in charge. It's just a lot of, interesting things kind of happened. Golda Meir, you've probably heard of her. She was the first woman prime minister in Israel. She was a strong woman, and actually there's a movie about her. I'll kind of mention that there at the end. But she was born in Russia, grew up in the United States because her parents kind of moved over like a lot of Russian Jews. And then when she got to be late teenager, early 20s, she decided she was going to move to Israel and join a kibbutz. And that's exactly what she did. And she ends up just having really gifts for administration, speaking. She learned Hebrew, and she learned English. She knew English because she went to school, elementary and high school. And so they sent Golda Meir to the United States to raise funds and awareness among the Jews and others. And one of her biggest accomplishments in life is that she got millions of dollars started flowing into Israel for weapons, because they knew that once the British went out, that group of Jews had to kind of defend themselves against all the Palestinians there. And also the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi, they all joined forces to prepare for this war of independence. Well, on May 14th, 1948, the British pull out, and Israel officially becomes a nation. And then at that exact same moment, war with all the Arab neighbors breaks out. Egypt, Jordan, Syria invade Jewish Israel, you know, the within hours of it becoming independent. And they were about, their armies combined, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, were about 6 million people. Israel only had about 1 million people altogether. And and most of them, women, teenagers, they had to fight. And basically they had to kind of fight for independence. And they didn't really have good weapons. They didn't have enough weapons. And it was basically 10 months of conflict. And amazingly, Israel is able to beat back the Arab nations. And after that, new boundaries, not the ones that the UN set, but new boundaries are formed. And Israel managed to get part of West Jerusalem, not the old city, not a lot of the city, but they got a sliver of Jerusalem as well. Now, probably, in fairness, there were some ugly things that some of the Jews did to some of the Palestinians. About 700,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled. And it's kind of interesting. Most of the Arab countries didn't want them either, and so they ended up going into Gaza or you know areas of the West Bank that Jordan was kind of in charge of, and but no one really wanted these Palestinians to go in there, and so the Palestinian problem in Israel, those 700,000 people who kind of fled to these areas. Uh, they've got children. They had children. They had children, and now they've been victims of war and sort of in a refugee state since the end of the War of Independence in 1949, and that's part of the problem. So when you kind of hear that they want their independence, they never really got it. And so I can understand kind of the frustration that they kind of have. I think it's important to kind of see both sides. So Jerusalem, as I said, was kind of divided in half. Actually, the Palestinian got the more the bigger part of it, the old city, and that went into the hands. Jordan was the one that was designated to kind of be in control of it. And King Abdullah the First, there have been several of those since. Jordan, he actually had the strongest army at that time, but he was also somewhat rational, and to he preferred to annex all of Palestine, but he was willing to compromise, and that was kind of good. In fact, the 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 movie Golda, which I'm going to kind of recommend, it kind of talks about Golda secretly meeting with him, trying to kind of negotiate peace. And anyway, you can kind of, I'll let you kind of fill in the details a little bit later. But I do want to kind of mention one other thing. Everything was okay into 1967, and that's when you have the 6-Day War. Now, let me give you a little bit of background on that. Egypt had a president or a leader, Gamal Nasser. And maybe I should just kind of mention, not since Muhammad back in the 600s had the Arab world ever been united. They're always kind of against one another. And a lot of it was who's going to be in charge of the Arab world. And no one leader ever really emerged. Well, Nasser stirs up the Arab world because he wants to become the leader of the Arab world. And so he gets Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and he starts kind of declaring that we're going to go in and we're going to wipe Israel off the map. Those were his words, And interestingly, Western nations just kind of remained silent because, after World War II, the Cold War, they weren't really sure they wanted to kind of get into that. So the nations start sending armies to the border. Egypt has 100,000 troops and all sorts of tanks that had been imported from Soviet Union. Syria had 75,000 in tanks again. Jordan had 55,000 troops just at the border, and they had tanks. And then Egypt makes the decision to close the Suez Canal to Israel and to blockade all, um, ships coming from or to Israel. And then Nasser, the rhetoric just kind of keeps building up, every day. He boasts that within the next couple of days, Israel will be history. It will be gone. There will be no Israel, because it's going to be wiped off the map. And and the boasting just kind of increased his image. In fact, all throughout the Arab world, there are pictures of Nasser. He's the leader of the Arab world. He's going to drive out the Israelis. Meanwhile, Israel, what are they going to do? You didn't have, not getting a lot of Western help. The United States kind of helped a little bit, but not a lot. And so they knew that they were going to be attacked within the next day or so. So Israel made a decision to do a preemptive strike on the Arab nations. So on June 5th, 7:45 a.m. Israeli time, all of a sudden Israel takes their whole air force and they go over Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. All the all the Egyptian planes are on the ground, they're fighter planes, and they bomb and wipe out the entire Egyptian air force, like in about 3 or 4 hours. Then they turn on Jordan and do the same thing there. And they just start kind of just bombing their troops. And the thing is, it got so, the Arab nations were just caught off guard completely. And in fact, the war lasted 6 days. And I can still remember this. It's just kind of a personal story. I was living in El Paso. I was probably seventh, eighth grade at the time. And I was kind of watching the events. And the day it started, uh, my family went and we rented a cabin in Big Bend National Park for 1 week. And I was so, I wanted to go, of course, but because I'd been looking forward to it, but I was kind of bummed because they didn't have any TV coverage there. And for 7 days, I didn't know what happened. And when I got back, the war was all over. I missed it. And because basically in those 6 days, Israel kind of goes into the Sinai Peninsula, go all the way to the Suez Canal. They go into Syria and take over the Golan Heights. They take over Gaza. They take over the West Bank completely. They take over Jerusalem. And within 4 or 5 days, the Arab nations are calling on the UN, make Israel stop. And Israel did, but they said, but we're going to keep the land as a buffer. In other words, we're not going to give up any of this land that we took over. And one of the things they did is they officially annexed all of Jerusalem. So for the first time since 70 AD, Jerusalem actually became a Jewish city. So annexing Jerusalem was a very important event in all of Jewish history. Nasser, what happened to Gamal Gasser? He was completely humiliated, obviously, and the other Arab nations were, and Israel, who was less than 20 years old, all of a sudden they appeared as they were seen as one of the elite armies of the world. So why don't we kind of stop there? Because those are the boundaries that we have now. Maybe I should kind of say this, that eventually, in an effort to make peace with Jordan, they gave back the West Bank. In an effort to make peace with Egypt a little bit later, they gave back the Sinai Peninsula. They did not give back the Golan Heights. It is part of Israel today because Syria never would kind of, come with some friendly terms there. And Jerusalem, they said, there's no negotiation about Jerusalem. Jerusalem's going to stay in our hands. And they made it the capital. And you've probably heard a lot about that recently because a lot of nations are moving their embassies to Jerusalem. And a lot of them still have them in Tel Aviv. Okay, so just real quick, I want to mention there's a lot of good movies here. The War of Independence, here's a few that I would recommend: Above and Beyond, Exodus, Cast the Giant Shadow. I would also recommend The Chosen, not the movie about Jesus, but it's a movie about two families in Brooklyn, New York. One who was really pushing for independence and one who was, against it because they were waiting for the Messiah. Very interesting. And then Golda. It's a long movie. I would definitely recommend watching that. And my understanding is just this week there's a new Golda Meir movie that just came out. I have not seen it, but I understand it's good. But I would definitely look at the old one because it's a classic. Thank you very much.